So welcome everyone. My name is Brigu. For those of you who don't know me, I teach in the anthropology department here at SOAS, and I'm one of the core faculty at CAMHRA, the Center for Anthropology and Mental Health Research in Action. And I won't say much about CAMHRA because many of you already are part of it or came from the previous lecture, but we began relatively recently, funded by a grant from the UKRI and are part of SOAS and anthropology. So within CAMHRA, we are hoping, Nora, my colleague Nora and I, to start a contemporary arts and mental health track, which we're calling CAMHRArts, which will aim tentatively to have three kinds of programs. Fellowships for artists to collaborate with SOAS affiliated scholars or CAMHRA lived experience fellows to co-create works in a range of expressive forms. Second, it will try to have fellowships for curators from the UK, but also from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, which is SOAS's traditional strength, to create projects with a mental health focus in collaboration with galleries in London. And third will be seed grants for new kinds of, hopefully, CPDs and CMEs, that is continuing professional development or short programs, designed across different expressive forms with artists and academics collaborating and with curators. So conceptually, as the title will tell you, many of us, we work with mental health practitioners like psychiatrists or in mental health spaces. But our idea of either health or illness is not necessarily defined only by biomedicine. And we are trying to think about different forms of vitality and distress and the way in which this figures across within scholarship and across a range of expressive forms. Our first attempt at creating kind of international collaboration will be piloted this summer with Khoj International Artists Association in Delhi, with a kind of co-collaborated or whatever co-hosted residency that will take place at Khoj in Delhi on themes of vitality and distress. And so the call for papers or call for proposals will be out soon. And so today's conversation is really a privilege and a first step in that direction, which is to bring people and spaces that we have admired and learned from, and to bring people into conversation, to brainstorm around these thought processes, and also just to learn what within our ecology is already happening in extremely creative ways around us. So I'll hand over to two colleagues of mine to introduce our very exciting group of panelists, but I'll just introduce our hosts and then they'll introduce our guests for today. Our hosts are Nora Woodker, who all of us will know from the department. She's a social anthropologist, artist, and architectural engineer. And Vera May, art historian, curator, and a SOAS PhD in art history, who recently joined the Royal College of Art. And the two of them will introduce our panelists for today and will host today's conversation on vitality, creative conversations on vitality and distress. So please join me in first thanking Nora and Vera for bringing our guests together and for this panel. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Brigu. All right. Playing around with the microphone is always fun. So, yes, as Brigu said, Vera and I started when CAMHRArts started to come into a bit more of a focus. Vera and I started to have a bit of a conversation. And what CAMHRArts is really about is the hope to co-create a dialogue on questions of vitality and distress that really weaves multiple ways of knowing and also diverse forms of expression together. And in this, foregrounding embodied visual and sonic epistemologies. So, and really to draw on a bit of more of an expanded vocabulary of mental health. And with today's conversation, we're hoping kind of like to think about three things. One is how artistic interventions can reshape our more academic understandings of vitality and distress in an expanded sense of mental health. We would like to think a little bit about methodological implications, where art is really a way of knowing rather than just an add-on. And really also, and this is particularly interesting with our wonderful panel, to discuss how sustainable partnerships can be equitable across these really like different practices, ways of doing things, forms and disciplines. So, Vera, would you like to start introducing our panel?
Sure. So lovely to be here. Lovely to be at SOAS. Always feels like coming home. So, and to be in such fine company as well. The first panelist I'll introduce is, to my far right, Dr. Richard Martin, who is the Director of Participation at Whitechapel Gallery, where he oversees a multidisciplinary program for all ages, developed in collaboration with artists, audiences, and creative partners. He is also a mental health champion at the gallery and was previously curator of public programs at the Tate from 2016 to 2021. His curatorial practice has been supported by teaching positions at King's College London, Middlesex University, UCL's Bartlett School of Architecture, and Birkbeck, University of London, where he completed his PhD in 2012. He is an associate member of the Centre for Arts and Learning at Goldsmiths, University of London, so I think quite a nice overlay between academic and art worlds, which would be interesting to hear further about. Next to Richard is Karim Sultan, who is a curator at Bethlehem Gallery, where he is responsible for exhibitions, artist development, and programs alongside the team. Karim is a curator and artist, and in a curatorial capacity has worked on and developed numerous international exhibitions and programs, focusing on modern and contemporary art, often left out of the art historical canon. Some of his areas of interest and work include artistic agency and mental health, music and sound practices and performance, critical approaches to animation and games, international histories of art and architecture, and photography. And as an artist working with music and sound, Karim has also presented and performed internationally. So I guess this dual side of being a practitioner, but also facilitator of programs.
And to my far left, we have Nefertiti Oboshi-Shandorf, a British Ghanaian producer and commissioner of site-responsive performances, audio and moving image, also non-gallery contexts. And her practice is one that actively seeks collaboration and is informed by the formation of protective networks, which is all particularly interesting to our conversation today. Formerly the artistic director of Pack and Platform, she's a member of the Art on the Underground advisory panel and a trustee for Artichoke and the engagement and participation lead at Wellcome Collection. And it's really lovely to have a neighbor who was able to just walk from around the corner. And of course, with the Wellcome Gallery being really one of the institutions that most directly connects human health and arts, it will be very interesting to hear from you as well. Now, what is going to happen is we're going to have a little bit of an entry point to each of our panelists for a little introduction, and then Vera and I are gonna bounce back questions, but also the panel is gonna chip in, and then we'll have good time for a Q&A from all of you at the end. Let's go.
Right. So, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with everybody. So, my name is Karim. It's always a bit strange to speak right after an introduction of a formal bio. Writing bios is one of the most brain-melting things I think you can do for yourself. Thank you. I'm also a bit soft-spoken today, so. But yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about Bethlehem Gallery and what we do, and there's an image on screen of the gallery. So Bethlehem Gallery is located in the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. Who has heard of Bethlehem Royal Hospital? It's often associated, it sort of comes into there's a idiomatic language with Bedlam, which has a lot of negative connotations. And so it's a active psychiatric hospital until today. It was in some form started in the 1200s. That's a whole other history, especially I'm sure at SOAS we have some some fun connections to be made with world history. But Bethlehem Gallery is an independent charity, independent arts organization that's based within the hospital site. We share a building with the Bethlehem Museum of the Mind, which is also the archive keepers of the hospital as well. And at the gallery, we work with a wide variety of artists. So artists who are currently service users at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, but also as well artists from South and Southeast London, but also kind of throughout London and nationally even, who've had sort of encounters with time with mental health and psychiatric institutions and the kind of mental health system in the UK. What we see here is an exhibition of a work by an artist named Mr. X, who's actually was the first artist that I encountered at Bethlehem before I joined the team about a year and a half ago. And yeah, there's so much to talk about. I don't want to take up too much time, but one of the things that we do at Bethlehem is to, especially in a context like this, and I'm sure we're going to come across this a bit more, but an active psychiatric institution, also as well, one of the wards on the hospital. So there's, for example, many wards. There's an anxiety ward. There's the mother and baby unit that specializes in postpartum psychosis. You know, these sorts of specialist wards. But then also as well, wards such as River House, which is what they call a medium security unit, essentially a psychiatric prison. And so many of the artists that we work with are either have recently come out of these institutions, or are artists who have had practices before or developed practices while they've sort of become service users. And I think we'll touch on this thing of what it means to sort of be an artist in a context like this. Because the gallery is an independent space, it's sort of something that's in the hospital, but kind of like an embassy or like an exclave. When people walk into the gallery, whether they're people who are on the hospital site, whether they're sort of people, residents of anywhere in the city, and are working as an artist, you're an artist. And this is sort of an ethos that we hold very dear, and that's a core part of our practice. I don't want to give away too much. There's so much to talk about, but unless there's something I missed. But yeah, I'll hand over the microphone.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. And I'm also rather softer spoken until I get cross about something. So my name is Nefertiti. Thank you so much for the energy setting in this room as well. Formally, I am engagement participation lead at the Welcome Collection. I'll explain a little bit about the work that I do. But just to acknowledge that the Welcome Collection is part of the Welcome Trust, which many of you will probably understand and know a bit more about. I cannot speak to that. The Welcome itself is like this, it's like a city within itself. And I cannot speak in real terms about the level of work, I'll get closer to the microphone, the level of work that they do, in the detail that they do, the funding that they provide, mental health, impacts of climate change and infectious diseases. There's a lot of history within there and a lot of work that's happening now. So within the Welcome Collection, I'm just going to act like that clicking isn't really loud to me. So no, it's okay, I'm being passive aggressive. So within the Welcome Collection, I've had therapy. So within the Welcome Collection, where I had been for 1 year, 3 months and 26 days, but no one's counting, I am engagement participation lead, and I sit within a team which is part of curatorial and public practice. So if you go to the collection, you'll see an exhibition, that's curatorial. Mine is engagement and participation, which is part of, also has a sibling team, which is the live team. The live team will have things called lates, which some of you may have been to before. If you consider the Welcome an organism, the lates are the blossom on the tree that flourish, and they bring people in.
and they're beautiful, and they take a lot of energy, but they let people know where we are. With engagement and participation, that's much more about what isn't seen and what's happening underneath. For example, if we're working with vulnerable communities, we're not going to put these communities on the stage to come out and re-traumatize. So the intention is to have longer form programming and longer form relationship development with these groups. So within my remit is something called the New Collections Gallery, which will be made public soon enough. I have a young people's program, I have schools program in SEND, and communities. So what I'm developing at the moment is what collaborative practice looks like in a place like Welcome, an organisation that has, being mindful, we're looking at what power looks like in a place that has resources and has a history. And there are teams across the Welcome that I'm connected to that figure out this slightly thornier question. So I come from small organisations that could be much more agile and maybe just hit the ground running, but because there are many considerations around health and impact and also mission, this is something we're quite mindful of. So Welcome's mission is underpinned by this sentence, which is a world where everyone's experience of health matters. And within that, it's how do we unpick that? What areas of health, what areas of the human story are we all experiencing? What can we change? What can we move forward with? What can we offer research and assistance with? My role is to make Welcome useful, or of use to people the collection of use to people who may not consider the collection. So this image here is from a new project that began maybe about 2 months ago, and it's called Stay, Play, Connect. And we're looking at perinatal mental health. We're looking at offering a gentle space and shifting the space so it doesn't feel like it's part of an institution. So part of that is lighting somatic practice, having care workers within the space. So caregivers can come in and just feel their bodies again. So the first year of postpartum has its challenges. So essentially my work is about institutionalizing the space and not re-traumatizing people. This is a work in progress, and we've got programs coming up that we can speak to a little bit more, and these are works in development. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So yes, I'm Richard. I'm from Whitechapel Gallery in East London. When I left my flat this morning, my partner's mum, who's staying with us at the moment, asked me what I was doing today, and I told her about this panel this evening. And she's retired now, but she was a nurse in the NHS for 30, 40 years. And when I explained what I was doing this evening, she said, "Why are you talking about mental health? I thought you worked in an art gallery." And I should say that actually she said it in a curious and semi-supportive way, rather than the skepticism that I read into this. You can psychoanalyze this in any way you like. But actually, I think it's a really important question to foreground in this discussion. And I also think it's a question we shouldn't run away from as people working in arts institutions, because it opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities and potential about why is it that why is it that we might think about our work in terms of mental health, how it intersects with mental health, particularly when we're not trained mental health professionals. But as I said, I think this opens up really, really interesting questions. And one way into this might be this fantastic quotation, which is on the screen here, which is from the American writer James Baldwin. "Life is more important than art. That's why art is important." Now, I think this is a quote that you could read in all sorts of different ways about what is the relationship between life as a category and art as a category, about what is a hierarchy of needs and where you might place art within it. But it's a title, a quote that we used as a title for a project at Whitechapel in 2023, and it's become a kind of perennial reference point for staff at the gallery. Particularly when things might be stressful and people are exhausted, that it's useful to say to a colleague, well, you know, life is more important than an art gallery. But I think it takes us into interesting places. And I think the first thing that I would like to say about Whitechapel and how our work might speak to some of the things we'll talk about tonight is I can't overestimate and exaggerate the importance of the locality of the gallery. So if you're not familiar with Whitechapel Gallery, it's on the High Street in the East End of London. We were set up in 1901, so this is our 125th anniversary year, and institutions love anniversaries. And we were set up with a mission that was specifically to serve the people of the East End. And I would argue, if you're thinking about what it means to serve the people of the East End, how can your work not be framed at this time in terms of mental health, in terms of vitality, in terms of distress? So just to give you some context around that, so the gallery is situated in Tower Hamlets, which is an amazing, rich, very diverse borough. It's the youngest, fastest growing, most densely populated borough in the country. And I think even just the density of the urban context is something that's worth thinking about in terms of vitality. But it's also a borough where about half the children grow up in poverty. It has one of the highest adult depression rates in the country as well. All of which is the context in which we're doing work at the gallery, and it poses all sorts of questions about who our work is for, who we're working with. And I think kind of extending some of the points that Nefertiti has already made about being useful, like what value can you add to a community in this situation? I would say that we might talk about all sorts of very interesting, innovative, artistic interventions this evening. But I would say in the last couple of years, particularly since the pandemic, almost the most value that we could add in this area locally was to make our building available as a civic resource, as a public resource for pre-existing groups. And as you suggested, Nefertiti, this is not necessarily like highly visible work. It's not necessarily work that gets the kind of press attention or the grandeur of a lot of other exhibitions or commissions. But the fact that our building is regularly made available for groups to meet, groups that might be working in terms of recovery and addiction, or specifically working around mental health, or charities working with migrants and refugees and asylum seekers, having a free public space, a space that is quieter than the high street, is incredibly valuable. A space that it's possible for people from different backgrounds to gather together, to meet, to exchange ideas, to pause, to breathe. This is almost the most valuable contribution that a public arts institution can make, I would say, at the moment. And we might talk about grander ambitions around this, but I would say at this point in time, 15 years after austerity, years after the pandemic, this is the situation in which the intersection between distress, mental health, and arts institution leads us. But I'd be really interested in where we might go with all these initial ideas.
Great. I think that's a wonderful segue into my first question, because I think you've set the landscape up really well, the three of you, in terms of talking about space and how to kind of facilitate bringing community in, as well as making what you keep visible and what you maybe keep invisible in terms of nurturing those connections. Maybe to talk a little bit more specifically about artistic research and artistic practice, and how these aspects might engage with issues around distress and mental health. And if this has come up in your organisations at all, in terms of how you might engage with either artists or existing works in the collection. And in this context, how is ideas of vitality and distress conceptualised, or if it's conceptualised at all? And I think it's interesting to host this panel because, for example, in my experience working in the visual arts, it's never mental health is not talked about in terms of vitality, for example. So I think that's an interesting terminology to bring into the conversation.
should we go in the order that we introduced ourselves in?
Thank you.
Yeah. So there's so many things to say, and I feel very lucky to be on this panel with not just everybody here, but also as well from Welcome and from Whitechapel as well. I learned recently that we had sort of a program with Whitechapel and with Welcome. We've co-organized, and there's so many artists who work between Welcome and Bethlehem as well. So there's conversations. This is sort of like a single kind of slice within a much longer historical conversation. And speaking of anniversaries, I mean, next year, Bethlehem Gallery celebrates its 30th anniversary. And one of the ways that Bethlehem Gallery started was essentially there was occupational therapists who were working at the hospital with people who were either had artistic practices before or who were developing an artistic practice. And there was space, of course, as we know, and as both of you brought up, space is kind of a tricky thing, especially in the city. Even in the late 90s when I should stop gesticulating, but when there seems to have been more space, apparently there wasn't enough, but a couple of rooms were located within Bethlehem Hospital, and that essentially became Bethlehem Gallery, a space where people could have a bit more of a place to exhibit art, to hold programs, to look at things, to comment and develop each other's work. And really this sort of ethos is the central thing, I think, with everything that we do at the gallery. And in terms of this idea of distress and vitality, I think I'll pose something, I'll sort of, if it's okay to kind of develop something a bit verbally now. Once I start talking, I won't stop, but it's sort of getting the engine going. But with artistic practice, and especially around issues of distress. So given where we are, we encounter people who are in various states of distress. One of the things that we can look at is what causes distress. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychoanalyst or a psychologist. I'm actually, how do we put this? One of the things that I've witnessed with my own kind of perspective is when a person's agency is diminished and when their life has limitations put on it in terms of time, in terms of space, in terms of what you can do, what you eat, what you wear, what medications you take, what effects those medications have on you, how you're allowed to speak, what you've done with your past, what you're going to do with your future. Essentially this erosion on the human subject. And this is the thing, many of us have unfortunately experienced it in some form or another, and have a feeling that this is going to be something that many of us will experience more in the future. But when you experience this kind of diminishing of agency and the limitations on your humanity, it's inevitable that you will find yourself in a situation of distress. And there's a kind of litany of terminology of pathologizing and carceral terminology that limits also the person further and further and further and further. And one of the things that I've seen myself, and this is one of these things where I kind of thought it was a bit idealistic, but when somebody has a chance to reconnect with or develop an artistic practice, this is one way in which a person who's been diminished in such a way can reemerge as a human being and attack as an equal, can respond as an equal, can say things that can be understood and are legible in many ways. And I think I'll put something here just as a kind of like provocation perhaps, but rather than vitality, I would say that the kind of antithesis to distress is not vitality, but is agency. Because people might not be necessarily quite vital when they have agency, but having agency means that you have some means to determine something in the world. And oftentimes, and I've seen this with my own eyes, and this is, again, something that I thought if you asked me 2 years ago, before I joined the gallery, I would have thought it was quite idealistic. But when you're in a room, for example, and you're somebody who's undergoing a kind of psychiatric evaluation, and somebody fires off a series of loaded questions that have a kind of evaluative matrix behind them, that go into sort of kind of corrective mechanisms, that go into sort of all the ways that we categorize and determine outcomes for various kinds of human behavior. When you're in a position when you are diminished and somebody's addressing those questions to you, and you respond again with in plain English, you're at a disadvantage. You have no way of winning in that scenario. However, if you go back and you have the ability to work in a space where you can create a work of art that can overpower some of those things, and at the next meeting, I'm referencing a particular artist, actually, in this case. I don't know if I'm allowed to say who it is and what they do yet. But for example, the next time this happens, there's an evaluation, and there's psychiatrists and care workers and hospital administrators. And they ask a question, and the person says, hold on a second. And they wheel in a large installation that hits them, that shows, that undermines the power in that sort of carceral language, and moves them, disarms them. Then a person has agency and can communicate something. And yeah, I think that's what I'll offer for now. I don't want to get too preachy, but
It didn't feel preachy.
okay. So
Not from here.
I'm undermining myself. This is the
Listening to you speak is so soothing. And thank you. We were at a conversation. We have lots of meetings where we are sometimes. I'm not going to speak about the amount of meetings we have, but something that came up that really stuck with me was 2 ears and 1 mouth. And it sort of felt like the kind of thing that my mother would say when she was like, 2 ears, 1 mouth, listen. And it's the, I suppose there's a temptation for organisations to broadcast and say everything that they've done, say everything that's of value, and say we can fix things. It's like, well, we can't fix things. We can offer space for things. And like you say, agency is an important part of that. And when we're speaking, when I see the word distress, I think about trauma and what it is to carry trauma, or for people who are carrying trauma, and how close that trauma may be to the surface, or how that trauma might be locked in somewhere. And always coming back to the idea that we are more than the worst thing that has happened to us. And that when people come to us as a museum, that, I say it again, that is not about re-traumatizing them, but then also what is it to go out and be in their space. Another, something you've made me think of is like the terminology that we use when describing. And so going back to being on broadcast mode, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with things such as NPOs, which are national portfolio organisations, organisations that are funded by DCMS, which is Department of Media, Culture and Sport. Did I get that in the right order? Yeah, it's a humanities degree. And it's the constant assertion of value and of worth and what's being done, how many people you reach. And it all starts to break down into, and we did this, and we did this, and we did this, and we do this. But within there's always this risk of losing what the point of view is as a conduit for care, as somebody who can offer something, who can offer space. So going back to ideas of distress, it's like, well, how do we reach people? So for example, a project that is coming up that we're developing is around gynecological health and care, but specifically from Black and global majority lived experience. And anybody who's had a chronic condition, or anybody who's had a chronic condition coming into the space, there's no way that we'd be like, and tell us about these awful things that you're going through and that you might have been medically gaslit for. It's just, my question is like, are you good? What can we do for you? So when it comes to distress, I feel that it's our role to soothe that, to acknowledge that it happens, but not, someone's suffering isn't for our funding application. And that's a previous life. In the Welcome, it's a self-funded organisation. So within there, it's about, I suppose it's about making sure that the words and the intentions and the language line up. Because we essentially report to ourselves, and like you were saying, you dropped a bar earlier, and I think it was around the human subject, and just holding on to the humanity, and understanding that when you use terms like marginalised, or person of colour, or whichever demographic, that you are sort of reducing a person down to categories that they can fix into, and it's our role to connect with the humanity of that. And I suppose people don't owe us, I know it's very different in your cases, but we're not owed people's trauma. Mm-hmm. And so it can be a space for gathering, but sometimes we just have to recognise that this far but no further, and just having space for people to be together and to be able to laugh and to deal with these really intense, sometimes violations or not impositions, intense lived experiences, but they are much more than this. So I suppose vitality comes from being able to hold space and offer space, and to know that you're not due to be part of every single conversation that happens within the space that you're offering. So yeah, 2 ears, 1 mouth.
I've been thinking about a couple of words that have come up so far. One is trauma and one is agency, and about what artistic practices might add to either of these. And if I think about trauma, I think about artists with a very strong ethical core who have thought very hard about historical trauma, about ruptures, about violence. So someone like the Colombian artist Doris Salcedo, who perhaps most famously kind of put the crack in the centre of the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern, but has worked very closely with communities who've experienced violence, and to produce works that are incredibly imaginative, and it almost feels like crass to say, but beautiful as well, and what it means to do that kind of work and to have that kind of outcome, given the histories and particularly the violence that underpins it. Or the Chilean artist Cecilia Vicuña, who left Chile after the coup against Allende in the 70s, moved to Stepney Green, of all places at that time, and you know, has made work since there, again thinking about those histories, those communities affected whilst in exile. And she was part of a group of artists who set up the amazing project Artists for Democracy. And I think these are examples of how people working ethically can think about historical trauma in really, really amazing ways. And I think that the second point around agency that Karim has mentioned is that I think the artists who I've had most joy working with in recent years have been artists who you might describe them as having socially engaged practices or participatory practices. And these are often artists who the central element of their practice is working with other people. So, for example, last year at Whitechapel, we worked with an artist called Jenny Pengley, who talks about the medium of her work being the workshop. So just as other artists might say sculpture or painting or moving image, she says the workshop is her medium. And she's exactly interested in the workshop as a space of creative agency, as a space of participation, about how do you create the conditions for somebody to come in and join a conversation or start making something, and then where could that lead? What might it generate? And I find this very, very inspiring as a methodology. And again, it's a set of practices that don't quite have the same kind of stardust or the visibility as an enormous figurative painting, for example. But I think in terms of thinking about vitality, these are incredibly vital spaces in all meanings of that word, where people are coming together, they're talking together, they're making together, and that this is something that artists bring to this discussion, that creating those kinds of environments. And there's a term that the artist Jasmine Banji uses for her practice, which I really like, where she says, this is very topical if you were watching the Winter Olympics. She says she thinks of her practice like curling, the sport curling, where she's like the person kind of brushing the floor ahead of the what is it called, whatever that curling thing is, as it's sliding on the ice, and that she's trying to always just slightly stay ahead of it and get out the way, so it's not, she's preparing the ground for something to happen, but she's not the center of attention. It's a different kind of artistic position, and I think that opens up all sorts of exciting possibilities for vitality in art spaces.
Thank you so much. I love the idea of the workshop as medium. Vera and I actually had a long discussion about that at one point, a very long conversation, which was lovely. And it's really interesting how this theme of space keeps coming up, holding space, opening space, and so on. I'm going to combine the next two questions together because I would love to give enough time for the audience as well. So I'm actually, this is a question for you, Vera, having led, organized and started an art residency in Singapore. And I feel everybody can chip in as well, but what is the value of artist-led projects, particularly, and I think all of you have spoke to that as well, like in maybe slightly distressing spaces as well, or contexts with disturbing histories possibly as well. But then also when having artist-led spaces and creating maybe different types of collaboration across disciplines, maybe also between, let's say, academics, practitioners and artists, how can those conversations or practices across forms of expression and genres, how can they look like?
Sure, I think Nora is referring to an artist in residence program I set up in Singapore between 2014 and 2016, which was part of a new contemporary art centre. And yeah, what's quite refreshing about this conversation is that when I was working on that, there were no kind of public conversations on mental health. And it was really about, I think, carving out a space for artists to, I guess quite romantically have a room of their own, giving them the resources to facilitate that exploration. So not only a studio space, but substantial stipend support. It was an international residency as well as a local one. So, adequate housing, all the kind of mechanisms, I think, that enabled you to thrive, including your bare living conditions, sorted out. But it was also a context where I think at the time, at least, it was the centenary of the country, where colonial history was being actively, I would say, celebrated rather than critiqued. So for us, it was an important forum to provide an artistic perspective that was somewhat, I think, as an institution, protective of that perspective, to be able to facilitate their own criticisms around notions of not only nationhood, but the ways that that might have been threatening to their own sense of vitality and creative practice. So I think this contradiction is quite common, actually, in a lot of institutions, that sort of, particularly artistic ones, that often demand productivity, and I think in that, often in a curatorial position or in another kind of, for the facilitatory position, the role is really to sort of protect the artist or the artistic perspective away from this being absorbed into these, often quite distressing metrics.
I mean, I'll add to that you used the term value, and Nefertiti raised the spectre of like the Arts Council and DCMS, and you talked about metrics. And I guess there was a long period of time in this country through the new Labour years when arts institutions were encouraged to think about their value in economic terms and about GDP and about jobs and growth and tourism. And this became a kind of defining feature of how do we think about the value of a museum of gallery. Oh, well, we can contribute this much to GDP. And I think if that was ever accurate or valuable post 2008, that kind of conversation, that argument ended. But perhaps a much more healthy discussion about value has emerged in the last couple of years and accelerated by the pandemic in terms of creative health and actually thinking about practices of care and what arts institutions add to this. I guess the caveat that I would add is that I hate talking about the art world as if it's just like a kind of singular thing or it even exists. But if we're going to use that term, like the art world loves a trend and it loves to latch on to things and then respond very superficially to particular theories, to particular forms of language that are circulating. And care has become very overused in curatorial statements and in exhibitions as a way of, some kind of justification of value, but actually without the thought, the care, the ethics that are necessary for that to be true. So I think all these conversations about value have all sorts of political and social contexts in which they're taking place.
So it makes me think about the conversation that we had prior, where, sorry, I've interjected, I haven't finished a sentence, is that we can talk about art and all the value of art, whether it's a protective force, how we can shift away from productivity, all these things about bringing people in, but also what you were saying about having the mechanisms covered before. It's like, how can people come to us? Why are people leaving their homes to come to us for when everything else might be in chaos? So, for example, with youth programs where people are like, we'll get young people in and they're going to do this. I'm like, young people are so busy right now. They are figuring out the next thing. I've heard of young people. It's like, it's figuring out, actually, why would they leave their maelstrom to come to us? What are we actually offering? And I don't know if this is Moira's quote, but Moira Lascelles, she was one of the directors of a project called Up Projects, and she said that we move at the speed of trust. And it's sort of like, art should not be done on people in that weird colonial, this is what goodness is, energy. It's very much like, you're not going to make this person eat this art that they have not contributed towards or had any say in. And it's just this this confluence, like you're saying, art is an ecosystem. And depending on how established whichever part of the ecosystem is, there is a thing about trends and following, and this is the nowness of it, X, Y, and Z. So I suppose it's, when we're talking about the value of this, it's the porosity that an artist can offer. It's a shift in perspective. Hopefully it's the ability to listen. I'd give a special shout out to someone called Mira Shakti Osborne. She's an artist I've worked with over the last few years and has this expansive practice. I got that. Expansive practice where you're looking at mental health, neurodivergency, what it is to be a diaspora, what it is to be somebody who practices outside of the institution or the organisation. There are people like Bolanne Tajuddin, who has an organisation called Black Blossoms, which is basically started off, I think, as a WhatsApp group and a curatorial project. And then now it's hundreds of people in a self-forming community. So I suppose it's that thing of like, actually, some of the most interesting work that's happening is happening outside of the institution. And every now and again, like a gallery or an institution will go, oh, we're going to do something like that. But you can't necessarily just pick something up and put it in a space. So I suppose the value of it is that you have a different perspective, and sometimes you just need to step back and let that thing happen without being too much in it.
It's, mind if I jump in? Yeah, so, no, thank you. I think there's that thing of like you mentioned, for example, taking something and dropping it in an arts institution or gallery and expecting it to work. I think there's almost like this opposite thing that, I don't know if it's opposite, but basically in order for people to be able to engage with artistic practice, especially I think in, we talk about distressing institutions, and especially when it comes to certain contexts like these, one of, like, you mentioned, for example, this thing of like socially engaged practice. There's also, I think, this other end of artistic practice, and a lot of artistic practice has this, which is that a lot of it is very like deliciously selfish to be an artist. It's like, has anybody listened to, for example, sat next to like a music practice room? Like, for example, like a lot of my thinking comes from musical practice, and if you hear musicians practice behind the scenes, working through your scales and arpeggios, the warm-ups, the strange kind of like things that you need to do to get your body and mind in sync with something. It's completely illegible, even to maybe another musician. It's something that's just takes an incredible amount of time. It takes even just this thing of having a practice room, having privacy, having a place you can trust. And that's something that is, especially now, like Bethlehem Gallery, my colleagues won't be offended if I say this, but the question of Arts Council and funding and stuff has come up. Like, we're quite broke, I think, in terms of arts institutions. Like, there's not a lot of money, and we're being continuously squeezed. It's incredible because you have, for example, books and conferences and findings in national and international arts and health and policy about like the importance of arts and health and creativity. But then at the same time, you go to the institutions that are essentially on the front line of these things, and then you basically say, we're cutting 50% of your budget. And then it's like, what are we supposed to do? It's like, well, like, be creative. You guys are artists, right? So, so it's one of these things where it's like a bubble, like there's a lot of surface tension, and you kind of have to have a lot of things to make the soap and the water and these things to have a bubble, and then but for the air to finally come into it and to have this perfect stillness in the inside where an artist can reside and do their work and actually think as a person, as a human being, takes this enormous amount of effort. Like, think of, for example, if you just even the silly thing, you want to make a soap bubble. What actually went into making the soap? How many sort of factories and extraction and oil and ships and I don't know what. And then you blow this little bubble, and for a second it lasts and then it pops. But I think there's this thing of like artist-led projects. Is it okay if I just give like an example or two? So, 2 projects I'm working on now. One of which is the current exhibition. This is my promo. Please come. But we have an exhibition now called The Places We Know. And Bethlehem Gallery is, we just a year ago launched the gallery's permanent collection. It's about 200 works. It's all accessible online. And these are works that have been acquired, been donated, works that are kind of being researched, that have been, storage is also a funny thing too. It's incredible. There are completely abandoned buildings, I won't say where, and it's difficult to actually have access to them. there's entire spaces, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of square meters of unused space that can be turned into studios, that can be turned into storage. Bureaucracy. But basically, there's a collection. And one of the things that's really fascinating about having a collection, and this is the question of interpretation, is you can look at the same 3 or 4 works in combination with one another and look at them in so many different ways. They can be interpreted. They can be interpreted in sort of countless ways. And so what we did with this exhibition is we worked with an artist and a poet to co-curate the exhibition with me. And one of the interesting things is that the artist who has helped me co-curate the exhibition is actually represented in the collection. And many of the artists who are in the collection are people she knows, are friends, are people she's been in workshops with. Halima Zakiuddin is the artist, and Jess Moraine, some of you might know, who is our exhibition poet, our kind of poet in residence, and is also the creative future writer in residence at Bethlehem Gallery. And so by essentially what I did was, like, I think sometimes it's very easy to overthink. What I did was I overthought for about 3 or 4 months and was completely paralyzed and emails piled up. But then what I did was, when it was time for our first meeting with the artist, was I opened up all our collection documents, the PDFs and the eHive cataloging software, and I basically was the person to be like, tell me to go up and down and what to click on. And I basically became the AI, I just sort of sat back and said, let me know what you want. And I kind of just scrolled, and then Halima said, I want this one, I like this one, that person's my friend. And I kind of went through the collection that way. And what we did was that, we spent a lot more time actually trying to understand what the selection was about, to find those kind of, why did you make these decisions? But for me, it was maybe the most fun I've ever had curating in my life, and maybe the most meaningful thing, because in some way I actually got to see how it works. But it was something where connections between works and an exhibition was put on in an entirely novel way. And having a poet also as well subvert my boring gallery texts is also a very beautiful thing.
You were preparing the ground. That's what you were doing.
That's exactly, yeah. I just stayed out of the way. It was amazing. Which actually behind the scenes, there's so much admin. 80%, 90% of the work is just budgets and emails and Excel spreadsheets and more emails and meetings. And
That's why we got into the arts.
I love Excel so much.
We love Excel.
But and another thing is there's also a project called the Bethlehem Artists Collective. And so we're working on an exhibition which is happening sometime next year. And the Artists Collective essentially started, it's artists from around the country. And one of the things that is also another challenge as well is that not everybody can come into the gallery. Not everybody can deal with international art, art English. There's that whole choreography of going into a gallery space and knowing what to do and where the labels are and how to look at a work. And one of the amazing things about the Artists Collective, the Bethlehem Artists Collective, is these are artists who, some of which are working in complete isolation, who are, bedbound essentially. And then others who are sort of nationally sort of represented and collaborate, and sometimes these are often the same people, which is also, every week we have a call. I moderate the sessions, and every week I get schooled. I get completely schooled. And that's one of the things that I think is also very important as well, is to be able to, there's that thing of, I can write the curatorial text, I can do the research, I can do these things and all of the other behind the scenes stuff. But being like, I'll make a cup of tea, and then you just sit and I'll do the cleaning up. I'll take the criticism, sometimes very harsh criticism, and learn from it. And these are things that are also kind of like, they didn't teach me this when I was doing art history. So, but yeah, so anyway, we'll go on. But.
Thank you to this wonderful panel for kind of like starting this discussion or this conversation where so much can happen, and I think where it is very interesting to start thinking about how to speak across different modes of thinking, of practicing, of doing in different disciplines, from mental health practitioning to arts organizing to artistic practice itself. So thank you so much for being part of this, for all these wonderful conversations that we have had, that we're having tonight. And yes, thank you very much to CAMHRA for making this possible. And thank you to the wonderful audience.